Okay, so Colin, the reason that I've asked you to come and sit down with our friends and us on this chilly day is to start to make a record of the early days of the crop circle research, because I think that a lot of people have come into the research recently and don't know the history. And I think a lot of people have come into the research claiming history that isn't accurate. So I think it would be useful to have a really accurate picture of the beginning of the phenomenon. And then, after this recording of the beginning of the phenomenon, I would like to also talk about what some of that early research was, kind of more in depth, like the plant analysis and the electromagnetic research and the different things that you did, back then, and what those results were. And also to talk about the anomalies and how the anomalies woke you up to the whole consciousness aspect of crop circles, and how that changed the arena that you're working in. Because again, clarity helps us learn and know.
Well, certainly there's many pieces to the pie.
Well, there are certainly many pieces. So for this time, you came into the research in 1983 when you saw your first crop circle. You were working in electrical engineering at a government level, overseeing many different offices across South Central England. Briefly, do you want to describe some of your first crop circle?
Yeah, it was two primary offices, but many people. There were about 200 individuals, direct labor force and contracted. But that was as far as my work was concerned, primarily electrical engineering, then promoted through middle management to include many of the other responsibilities. But yes, I was on my way from one office to the other on, actually, I think it was a street lighting problem we had in the southwest region of the county. And it was a perfectly normal, regular day, clear weather, sunny, there's no problem weather-wise. So I was driving on high ground near Winchester, about 14, 15 miles from Andover, where I lived, and looked to my left down into an amphitheatre, a large wheat field, in which I was shocked to see something that I'd never seen before, 5 circles forming across. And that really was the beginning of the last nearly 4 decades now.
Okay, so to clarify that, when you say 5 circles forming across, you mean a circle in the center with 4 satellites, correct?
That's correct. Like you would see 5 dots on a dice.
Right, and so when you refer to the cross, you're referring to the Celtic cross, which was that circle around a central circle.
Correct.
Which could also be thought of in other cultures as other symbols. But
yeah, absolutely. So, and of course, we dug into that as the research developed and the patterns changed. So the research changed with it.
Right. And you went down, as I recall, after work, you went down into that field, you examined it, you were quite surprised by what you found. You couldn't see evidence of people having been there to make it.
Very, very, very surprised. And to this day, I still reflect regularly to that time in that field. Yes, I attended my meeting. I went back to Andover to the other office, finished at night. I couldn't wait to get out there because that's all I was thinking about, was what in the world was in that field. So I went back, I walked out into the field. Took me probably 20 minutes. It was a larger field than it looked from the highway. And I was extremely surprised that it was hard to locate because, as people have learned over the years, anybody that's attended these fields to look at crop circles and look for them, is that when you're down at ground level in the field, the plants are pretty well up to your navel, and you've got a very restricted angle with which you can locate a shadow or a depression.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I found my way to the central circle and then the 4 satellites, and stood still, which is what I did initially. I didn't actually go right into them. I stood there, and all I could hear was, in the very background, was the buzz of the traffic high up on the highway overlooking it. But I could hear these clicking sounds. It's like individual clicking sounds, and once I'd located where they were coming from, and these were the plants unlocking themselves. They had woven themselves, you might say, held themselves together on the floor at right angles, flattened to the ground. And one by one, and in some smaller groups, they were unlocking themselves and beginning to lift slowly back up to the sun, which over the years I've certainly learned is a natural process. But what it did indicate to me from the beginning, or I thought it did, and I think it did, was that had not been there long.
Yeah.
This was me looking at something that had only appeared maybe minutes before, but certainly.
Well, but you had seen it in the
Yes,
morning, so
yes,
earlier that day, so maybe the night before. Maybe.
absolutely.
Yeah.
There was no knowing.
So you went and you talked to the farmer.
Yep.
And the farmer explained that he had seen these before. He had never seen them before.
Well, I went to search out the farmer, and in trying to locate the farmer, I also discovered that there was a man, a former NASA man, engineer, electromechanical design engineer, whose name and great friendship as the years went on was Pat Delgado. And so Pat and I then made contact directly at the door of the farmer.
So the two of you showed up there together?
Yeah. And
independently, or had you connected
we
first?
went on the telephone. We learned of one another's interest, that those initial inquiries, and we arrived. I think probably for we had heard. I mean, here's the raw truth of the matter: is we had heard that the farmer was not an easy person to deal with. He was aggressive. He didn't like the intrusion. He didn't ask for the intrusion in his fields. And of course, we asked, well, what intrusion? I mean, this is something that's appeared. It's new. He said it might be to you, but we've had these over the years. And in fact, his father's father, knew of these right back, he said, to 1923.
That's really fascinating.
So the beginning was not the beginning.
Right.
It was the beginning for us, but the farmer had seen them in that locality for quite a number of years.
And did the farmer at that time say anything about, their theories on where they came from or how they got there, or any anomalies that happened?
They really didn't know, because it was not on that occasion, but several occasions down the road when again we would tap his door and say, there's something else in your field. Years later, can we go and look? Begrudgingly, he usually allowed us. And on this occasion that I'm now thinking of, he refused to go any further, told us it was the last time. But his wife in the background asked if we would allow her to come with us back to their field. Mm-hmm. And she was clearly extremely interested. Mm-hmm. She stood there. I've got photographs of it. Maybe we can bring it up on the screen. I've got photographs of her, and she's in deep thought of wonderment, and with wonderment, how did these get there? So there was interest in the family. It was perfectly natural. But his job was farming,
right? And
that was the beginning.
Okay, so they had never encountered anyone making them. They had never seen lights in the sky. They had never had any indication of how they got there.
They did not.
Right.
Others
from 1923 on. So
that's right.
Before we move on to others, do you remember? And it doesn't matter if you don't, because you can insert it later. But do you remember the name of the farmer?
Bruce. Farmer, yes, Bruce. B-R-U-S-S-C-E. Farmer Bruce. So I've forgotten his first name, but Bruce was his second name. The Mattingley Farm, I believe, was Mattingley Farm, Chesfoot Head near Winchester. For anybody who wants to look in detail at that beginning, it's in Circular Evidence, the first book that I wrote with Pat Delgado. Yes. So
before we get to that, so you and Pat met there at the farm. You started to share your interest with each other. You started to call each other and go out together whenever either of you heard that there was one of these somewhere in the field. And during those investigations out in the field, you ran into another person researching, or did you hear of him, Terrence Meaden?
I'm trying to think how that worked. I think, well, I know, I don't know how exactly the first connection was made, but Dr. Meaden, Terrence Meaden, was the head of the Tornado and Storm Research Organisation in Wiltshire, And he made contact, I believe it was this way round, it wasn't with me, which with Pat. So those two made contact with one another. They knew of one another, although I didn't meet him for several months, I believe, later, because it was Pat and I, and then very soon later, and again, I think the connection was Pat, Busty Taylor, to myself, to Terence. It all happened within a short period of time of one another.
So the four of you began working together as a team. Terence Meaden being and Pat Delgado as a NASA engineer, and yourself as an engineer, all being scientifically oriented, and Busty being a pilot, a small air pilot, able to take you over the fields for photographs. And the four of you.
It was a perfect team. It was the perfect team. I mean, one was deeply rooted in science, a physicist, electrical engineer, meteorologist, published. In fact, he was the editor of the meteorology magazine. It published in Britain. So, he was deeply rooted in science that we thought, and he thought, might account for these initially, being a vortex, a natural vortex. He was the head of the Tornado and Storm Research Organization, so there's nobody better to look at that aspect and possibility. But, the Pat Delgado was electromechanical design engineer out of Woomera, that working then for NASA on the Mariner tracking project that they were doing with NASA, for NASA. And Busty came along as the very willing and very deeply interested, again, light aircraft pilot who flew us thousands of miles in the years to follow.
So that first year that you investigated them, that was June 30th that you saw your first crop circle. And in the rest of that summer, how many circles would you say showed up that team investigated?
There weren't very many. I would have to pull the database up to know how many. But this was the period where the Celtic, as I'm calling it, the Celtic cross, the quintuplet set, the 5 on the dice, the one that I saw initially myself at Chesford Head, there was a whole series of those. This was the era of the quintuplet set. The previous years, which I had not seen but Pat had, and Terence Meaden had seen several single circles, we saw more later, all of us, and many later. But prior to the quintuplet set came 2 circles, a larger circle and a smaller one alongside one another. Then it was 3 circles and formed a straight line. Then it was 5 forming a cross. Then it was 1 with a ring around, 1 with 2 rings around, 1 central circle with 2 rings, and 4 satellites. And so they evolved. So
the complexity of them evolved, and as well, so did the construction of them, right? In the beginning, describe what it was like.
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of people don't appreciate the fact that whilst for any engineer or scientist, the swirling pattern is information, and it's important information. But to many who were keen in just simply looking and photographing, there was nothing that particularly special other than spiral plants flattened to the ground. But that evolved, and it became a fact that the not just the symmetry, but the complexity and patterning of the floor lay itself became as interesting and intriguing and mysterious as the actual geometry they were forming. And so in the beginning, they were just simply laid at right angles, flattened to the ground, and forming constructs, geometries, like we've said.
So they swirled from the center out, or from out into the center?
All but one at that time was swirled from the center out, both clockwise and counterclockwise. That is, all of it was clockwise in one, and another pattern might be all anti-clockwise, counterclockwise in another. But that changed, and it could well be and was that from time to time they were both. But in one occasion, and this one stands out, which should be mentioned, I think, at this point, because it's pivotal in the complexity of the floor lay being important. And that was Busty Taylor, not from the sky, but he was a driving instructor too. During the day, that was his main job. He was driving with a student back from Winchester to Andover in Hampshire and saw a depression in the field, which we became very good at doing in time. And he'd sought this out when he had dropped his client off, and we got permission to go into the field. Once again, the farmer there said that his family had seen them over a number of years. So there was a second one on that front too. But this was different. This was very different. Terence Meaden set off from Wiltshire. We met him over there at a place called Headbourne Worthy, just outside Winchester. And this time, the swirl was from the outside, from the circumference to the centre, in a counterclockwise, what looked to be counterclockwise. It was a counterclockwise swirl, symmetry, but with the plants lying in the opposite direction.
That seems almost impossible.
It's very bizarre. And that stands, I mean, it's in circular evidence. It's one that stands to be very different to this day.
Okay, so you can put a picture of that into here.
Yeah, and incidentally, that was extremely interesting. It drew a lot of attention to the scientific fraternity. It pulled a lot of scientists, albeit very quietly, non-publicly, to the subject. Scientists were still very nervous of any connection with this subject because of the perceived association that they might have with the UFO.
Right.
So I was invited to publish a piece on that detail, that floor lay detail, in the Journal of Meteorology that was being edited and published by Dr. Meaden.
So we're going to talk more about the floor lays and the intricacies and the weaving of them as time went on in another broadcast. But one of the ones that really was a surprise to me is the one where you have pictures of it going clockwise, and then the next day more pictures are taken and it had changed and was going in the other direction, which I thought was quite astonishing.
Yeah, and it expanded a little.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that later. So in this early team, the four of you going out and doing this, who were the next, I mean, well, okay, so you were doing a lot of media. The media got wind of what you were up to. You started sending pictures. You talked to the military of defense.
Yeah, I was in a privileged position. It was just in my job. I had periphery contact with them anyway, with lighting installations, highway situations in the area of the military, which is a very militarized area in central southern England. So yes, I had contact with them. I was able to do something which actually surprised me how easy it was. That because I think they trusted me, they were able to know who I was and where I came from.
And that you worked for
I worked for a branch of government, and I was able to obtain the pilot's photographic information. In other words, photographs of crop circles.
And so what you're saying
from the military
is the military was interested that these were showing up, and a lot of them were showing up on military land, and they weren't ignoring it. They were taking pictures and they were doing their own examination. Yeah,
yes. Again, is a point that's being missed. And I think that today some of this information is not being sought out because the ground baseline of data and research was carried out right at the beginning by our team, and it's been you might say in a way hijacked. I don't want to sound competitive in that sense, but it seems to be a human frailty that it's there and it's used, but it's never credited.
Well, the record needs to be correct.
Well, it's what you were saying about misinformation or rewriting history. The true history, as far as the military is concerned, is that they were appearing on military land. You cannot fly over military land in southern England without clearance from air traffic control. These are military zones. You cannot do it. I mean, the missiles are fired off there. This is a large exercise area. It's one of the largest in the NATO alliance in central southern England. Salisbury Plain, Porton Down. These are all known military areas. And these circles, simple circles, were appearing on their land. And I've got photographs that I took of the military taking photographs of some of those.
I know the military tried to pretend years later that they had not been interested and had not been involved, but it would be absolutely insane for them not to be interested in something happening on their land and affecting national security.
Well,
so
absolutely.
they would have to be interested. What was more interesting is that they were willing to work with you and share photographs with you
Yeah.
and take your data and share data with you,
Yeah,
which was not happening with other people at
it
that
was not
time.
happening. I was in contact with the name that is now known. It wasn't at the time, generally speaking, was Nick Pope, who was the head of the Ministry of Defence's UFO investigation desk.
That was later
So-
on, though. That
Well,
was the early days.
it was early days. It was not at this point, but it's further, a little bit further back than most people are aware. I've a lot of correspondence. I attended meetings with him in London, in Whitehall. He arranged some contact with the photographic departments out of the top secret, which it was then, a top secret air research establishment at Boscombe Down, very close to Stonehenge. Well, again, this is information that was not known to the public.
Right.
You know, I went to that base. I was taken into that base where the cruise missiles were secretly being kept. I was staggered myself that I had been given access to this, knowing how sensitive the entire situation was with 11, I think, underground facilities for these missiles. But nonetheless, I was shown and have since have published their own photographs.
Okay, so at what year did you make a presentation to Parliament?
I'd never made a presentation to Parliament. Not in front of a microphone in that fashion.
Yeah.
No, I see what you're saying. The first report, the technical report they received was from me. I sent several through a military contact who approached me on behalf of the cabinet for the Margaret Thatcher cabinet, Margaret Thatcher government, and the head of state, which was Queen Elizabeth. The same report went to both of them. And that would have been in 1989, I believe it was 1989. And two of them were from sites that the military were already monitoring themselves. So they had their own photographs. I supplied others with ground data. I had the report from Colonel Edgecombe, who was the colonel responsible for the helicopter surveillance and reconnaissance for the Ministry of Defence out of Middle Wallop in Hampshire, close to my home. And the comments were very revealing that from the person observer on that helicopter was a major, and he stated that it was impossible for several of the satellites, and remember we're now back to the quintuplet sets, to have been gained access for human construction by what they could see from the helicopter. I have those photographs too. So this was a challenge. It was a challenge, although we were very open. But many people think we flew off, at a tangent and placed a UFO tag on the subject early on. What we did that the scientific fraternity didn't and were nervous of, including Dr. Terence Meaden, was that we were reacting largely to the fact that the geometries appear to us with evidence, strong evidence, to have positioned themselves at ground level to ground features. In other words, the topography and the pattern had a bearing on one another, where we had color variation by nutrient uptake of the plants or by the fertilizers that they were using. These were only visible from the air. Ground design, ground patterning of the tractor that seeded the tram lines, they became known as tractor tire marks, in other words, where the seeds were sown of the plants that germinated, that made the field, that made in which the crop circle appeared. These were not random, and they
Right.
never were random in those early days. They were very specifically
They were
positioned,
precisely.
and often with color variation not visible from ground level. That steered us at that time away from humans and towards something in the sky,
Mhm.
something that could see the ground.
Or underneath. Okay, so you've just alluded to a falling out, if you will. You didn't allude to it in a big way, but I picked it up between you and your teammates, and I'm assuming that this has a lot to do with differences in ideas of how they were constructed and why they were constructed. So Terrence Meaden had his take that it was a weather phenomenon. You and Pat were thinking it was possibly UFO or something underground.
Yes, I think, just to add though, it was more, Pat was a little more nervous about the UFO connection. He was inclined to pull back a little bit. I was inclined to push it to the edge, because I thought that was the challenge, that if it suggested the possibility, we should be stating it, that the UFO or something in the sky we didn't understand might be involved. So most of the reaction to the intelligence being a possibility came back on my shoulders, although Pat was certainly leaning in that direction.
Mhm. So when did you guys break apart as a team?
Well, we came and we went several times, but it was very obvious we weren't going to survive because of the public side of this. We were, however we got on as friends, or acquaintances and colleagues,
Mhm.
privately, we were forced to react to one another's theories on television cameras. And that forced a position. You couldn't say, on the one hand, we think, or I think, there's a possibility here of an intelligence involved, and the intelligence maybe is not human. And then see them, even hearing me say that, would turn the camera towards Terence and say, well, of course, that's just nonsense, because science can account for everything,
Right.
and there is a scientific explanation, and this is a plasma vortex.
Right.
And so we were we were put into a position where we did break up, and not that pleasantly either. It was a great shame. It was. It still hurts me to this day, because there was never any real need for it. The media, we were put in the position by a media that was still out of balance. It was not then comfortable to deal with the UFO other than to put it into little green men terms, which meant if you associate, you are one of those. We only held the credibility at all on this subject because we were professional people.
Mhm.
We were able to,
Mhm.
show, demonstrate that we were using scientific protocols. We were open-minded and trying to explain it in rational scientific terms with those protocols.
All right. So it seems like a silly question in some ways, but these are just random things showing up in fields. When you saw your first one, the whole carriageway was full of cars. Nobody but you stopped and looked at it and saw it and reacted to it. What made the media get interested in this? How did the media get interested, and what happened with all of that?
That's a good question. I think it was a first. It was the first time, and I put that out to anybody to challenge it, that UFO possibility could be associated, connected rationally to several guys, a team of scientists, as they put it, investigating a mystery which had some credence and had some lasting power. I mean, they were 40 years down the road now. Here's me and us talking to over the air to a term that is known by most people around the world, and a term that I coined, crop circles. But right back at the beginning, without this and without credibility, it would have been laughed out of.
Nobody would have noticed it was even there.
Never there. It wouldn't have lasted any more than one transmission.
So
But it didn't.
did the media interest come after you and Pat Delgado wrote the first book, or did the media interest come prior to the first book?
That, again, good question. It all happened within a period of about 12 months. Prior to the book, it was primed for the book. That's, I think, probably why it became an international bestseller, was the fact that it had been primed by a media that couldn't let it go in the end. I don't think the public would let it go.
Mm-hmm.
These were the discussions in every pub in the country. Was, have you heard of these crop circles over a pint of beer? It might be a slight laugh, but it was, no, but how could they make those? Well, if you've seen them, how could they see? And, all the reasonable questions that people ask were being asked by the media. And I was doing 2 to 3 television interviews a day at one point. They were coming from all over the place, all over the world. It was going out in Taiwan, in China, South America,
and that
USA.
was after the book.
That was it after the book. But
Yeah,
before the book, it was a growing interest in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
It had just spiked into unsolved mysteries in America.
Mm-hmm.
There was a growing interest, and it very soon after circular evidence went huge.
Mm.
Every television station was wanting interviews. Every magazine wanted to publish articles.
So I guess what I'm curious about is, did someone in the media see a crop circle and become fascinated by it and begin to promote it? Or did you guys send pictures to the media and say, look what's happening in the field, you guys should be interested?
Both things did happen. There were individuals. Remember this, when something goes big now with media, big means millions. Mm-hmm. And that is what happened. But there were individuals, like there's a guy called Humphreys in Southwest News Agency in Wiltshire. He had a particular interest. He was always asking for updates, and each one was published. John McNish in BBC Television was instrumental by personal interest in out of Pebble Mill Studios, BBC Studios in Birmingham. We did a number of television programs for them. We also went out live on Daytime Live, a very major program in Great Britain. And he had a personal interest, wrote a book on it, and maybe we'll refer to John further down the road.
Yeah. All right. So moving on from that, who were after you guys? Who were the first? Who came after that in terms of researchers? You had the CCCS coming in. The Richard Andrews.
Yes, the next wave were people that had made contact with us. That couldn't feel that they could get enough information quickly enough to feed their own interests. We could only do so much, and believe me, it had tremendous stress on their families. We didn't know which way to look. It was us now, me trying to do a significant job, senior official, plus at the back end of a retained fireman, in Andover, reacting to calls for a short time, trying to help the local community in my area of Andover, plus a media that was calling the switchboard in the offices I was. It all happened so quickly. Sorry, what was your question?
You expect me to remember?
You're going to stay on your toes with this.
Who came next?
Who came next were the people that were trying to get some attention because they wanted more information. And that was people like George Wingfield, Lord John Hannington, the House of Lords, who they were friends. Richard Andrews, a Dowser. It sort of expanded out of that towards a new organization. We had formed CPR International, Circus Phenomena Research, and that was our small team plus others that came in and helped support the work that was involved on the ground and in the air. And then the next layer that came on the top was a second organization, which we were not part of. We were invited to be part of, but we chose to be in control of our own data and our own direction, which I think was the right decision. And that was the CCCS, the Centre for Crop Circle Research, also located in Britain. Michael Green became their chairman. Professor Archie Roy, who had been working closely with us and that first team, kind of like bridged between the two organizations, and they became their own entity. I was still, at that point, the primary contact with British government's departments, the chief scientific advisor to the British government, and also the Farmers Union, who wanted representation because the farmers across the whole of southern England were being inundated with people looking for these circles if they had them on their land, wanting access to them. And appeals were going out to the Farmers Union to get involved because there had to be some level of control. It was getting out of hand. It was out of hand. There is no question about it.
Through the 90s with the massive numbers of people going to southern England to see the crop circles.
And we had from a couple of incidents on the way through, as history does, with foot and mouth disease, where every cow in Great Britain was slaughtered to try and control that horrible disease.
That was mad cow disease.
Mad cow's disease. Oh no, foot and mouth
came first, and then mad cow disease
came after that. But there were two sequences on the way through that drew attention to the public gaining access in an uncontrolled way to the farming community.
I see. Well, is there anything else that you want on this part of the record of the beginning days?
I think there is, and I'll try and say it without an edge, because we are at the same time putting history in the correct order and accurately, so that we can see this whole thing build from where we were in the early days to how we perceived the result of data and findings further down the road. But how it's recorded in history is how it's recorded in the literature, the television programs, and what was said on those television programs, and the written form, the books that have been written by other people, as well as myself, you and I together, Pat Delgado and I as co-authored. That became extremely inaccurately recorded as time went on. If anybody that visits Wiltshire today and attends the English Heritage offices to obtain, the sites of interest, archaeological sites, and crop circles, which is now officially in their literature trays for people that are visiting, you'll find the wrong names attributed to the wrong things on the crop circle front. It has been rewritten extremely unfairly and knowingly inaccurate. And I won't, of course, name names. There is no need to. But the accurate history has been accurately recorded in the books that we have written. Beyond that, it's not accurate. Largely,
there are a lot of inaccuracies, and there's a lot of royal we.
Competitiveness is unfortunate.
But we can say unequivocally and in the record that the first book written on the subject was written by you and Pat. It went worldwide. It made crop circles a worldwide phenomenon and began the interest from around the world into the phenomenon, which brought the most extraordinary people. We have met the most extraordinary people in the fields researching this, from Native Americans to Tai Chi specialists to scientists, from astronomical and Gerald Hawkins and his mathematicians. I mean, we have met extraordinary people
and traveled the world doing it. Looking at sites in various countries, presenting information around the world. It's been absolutely extraordinary.
So it is a much bigger phenomenon and a much bigger question than just whether they're human-made or not human-made. And that's what we will be exploring in our next sequence.
This is why this one they're all going to be very important, one piece to another, because the biggest mystery of our time is tied up in this. We are part of this in a very much bigger way.
Yeah, the whole consciousness unfolding is an interesting piece. So I actually feel very strong right now to mention Richard Andrews and to acknowledge the tremendous input that he had, and most of it unrecognized. And
Yeah, well, thank
he
you for
touches
saying
me
that.
in some way. So
It was because it was so desperately sad.
mm,
And yes, hard work coming from the heart.
mm.
Research that was meant to be done was done with little thanks, and he got his share of knocks too for doing so. So yes, I'm pleased that you raised
So
that.
we'll bring him up again in the dowsing segment.
Yeah,
Because he was an exceptional dowser, one of the best. All
yeah.
right. Well, Colin, thank you so much for your time
Thank you,
today. You're
Synthia.
very welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you all for listening.